and Inequality Research. And I'm very happy that you are all here today for this sort of informal event, which we're calling Looking Ahead, Priorities and Policies for the Biden Administration. As you likely know, one of the 17 executive orders signed by the president on Wednesday sends an explicit directive to federal agencies to engage comprehensive approaches towards improving the lives of those who have been adversely affected by persistent poverty and inequality, and to redress inequities in existing programs that serve as barriers to equality of opportunity. The directive calls on the federal government to allocate resources to address, in quotes, historic failure to invest sufficiently, justly, and equally in underserved communities. And it calls on the federal government to promote equitable delivery of government benefits. In spite of all the obvious challenges we're facing in this current moment, I'm incredibly hopeful that this statement of priorities represents a real opening for us to make substantive progress on the complex problems of poverty and inequality in the United States, both in terms of addressing problems that have been around for a very long time, as well as addressing inequalities that have been enhanced by the pandemic. So I am delighted that we have 9 center affiliates here to share their collective wisdom today. The expertise of these faculty members spans a range of disciplines and topic areas, and they're going to provide their insights on a variety of topics about what the new government should, can, or is already planning to do. This is going to be very informal. Each of us is going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then we will immediately go into breakout rooms so you can ask questions about whatever it is that you are most interested in. The topics associated with each breakout room will be listed, and you can go back and forth across rooms as much as you want until about 5 o'clock. So since I'm already talking, I'm going to share my own insights first. So now I'm going to change hats from my role as center director to my role as a researcher who focuses on issues related to intergenerational mobility and long-term investments in children. And what that means is that I study the processes that lead to the perpetuation of poverty across generations and the role of the US safety net in mitigating those processes. So even if you are a poverty expert, you may not realize that child poverty is higher in the United States than in almost any other developed country in the world, that poor children's chances of growing up to escape poverty in adulthood are lower than in almost any other developed country, and perhaps not coincidentally that the US spends less on child poverty than almost any other developed country. We do all know, however, that by almost any metric, poor children do less well than non-poor children, and that this is true whether we look at contemporaneous measures of children's health or academic achievement, or whether we look at later life outcomes such as their health or earnings in adulthood. For a long time, the debate among economists and policymakers was whether these differences in outcomes among poor and non-poor children resulted from the experience of poverty itself, or whether there were other unobserved differences between poor and non-poor families that were generating these outcomes and that could not be changed by providing poor families with more resources. But over the last 10 years, improvements in data availability and advances in research designs have enabled researchers, including several who are at the center, to explore this question with a lot more credibility than was previously possible. And that research has made it incredibly clear that there is a causal effect of income on children's short and long-term outcomes, and that safety net programs can make a difference. So I'm really excited to see that Biden's stimulus package includes a plan to expand and make refundable the child tax credit and provide up to an additional $3,600 for young children and $3,000 for older children this year. Now, the current proposal would make this a part of the stimulus package and therefore short-lived, but the scuttlebutt is that the Democrats are hoping that once this provision is on the books, it will be harder to get rid of. A recent report by Columbia University suggests that Biden's child tax credit expansion would cut child poverty by 50%. So that's huge. Moreover, the preponderance of evidence suggests that a permanent income boost of this size would improve long-term outcomes that are associated with self-sufficiency. And we don't have a strong history in American politics of evaluating potential investments in terms of their long-term benefits. But I think it's important to consider the possibility that an investment in children that increases self-sufficiency or health in adulthood has the potential to pay for itself in the long run through higher future tax revenues, reduced welfare payments, or reduced medical costs. In fact, recent work by Nathaniel Hendren suggests that among social insurance and welfare policies, childhood investments through monetary and in-kind transfers and through education have the biggest payoff. However, whether that actually happens or not depends a lot on how the program is ultimately designed, the extent to which it gets phased out at higher incomes, and where the cutoff level of income ends up being. This is important because the program is expected to be very costly. And while there's a lot of evidence that money matters to poor children's outcomes, it's less obvious that income boosts affect equality of opportunity when they occur further up in the distribution, the income distribution. From what I can tell, the current plan would be to provide this benefit to families with very high incomes, like up to $400,000 in some cases. So another way of putting this is that I'm not fully in support of a universal basic income program because it would be enormously expensive and not necessarily make a substantive difference in opportunities for medium and high income kids. Just a couple other things. Another thing I really like about the possibility of a permanent CTC expansion is that it provides help through the tax system, which avoids the stigma that's often associated with program take-up and which is believed to prevent some individuals from participating in programs for which they are eligible. And because it would be refundable, the child tax credit has the possibility of reaching a number of children who have fallen through the cracks since the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, which makes it difficult for poor families to receive cash assistance unless the parents are working. And because the CTC would provide families with cash, it would allow them flexibility that is not available through targeted in-kind benefits like housing vouchers, WIC, or SNAP. Although I should also make very clear that I am hugely in support of those programs as well, because the evidence that childhood access to those programs also has big impacts on short and long run measures of well-being is very strong. The new administration is also pushing a 15% increase in SNAP benefits as part of this pandemic relief, which would disproportionately benefit the program's poorest participants. SNAP, which Marianne Bittler will almost surely talk about a bit later, is, in my opinion, due for a revamp because benefit levels are based on outdated food budgets. And again, because the research unequivocally makes clear that SNAP makes a substantive difference in children's life chances. Finally, I would like to touch on just one more aspect of the proposed child credit that will be important to its success, and that is ensuring that it is both administratively straightforward and well advertised. We all know that tax returns are complicated to navigate and that many individuals who do not have earnings do not file, but these may be families who need the money the most. Whatever we can do to reduce the barriers to take up is going to be incredibly important. I mentioned before that the countries that have the most upward mobility also have made the most generous investments in their children, but these countries also tend to be countries in which the different components of their welfare system are well integrated and easy to access. In the US, we provide some aid to families with children through the tax system and other aid through various agencies like HUD, HHS, the Department of Agriculture, and so forth. Each has a different structure that makes it extremely difficult for an individual to navigate. And I'm sure that it's sort of a pie in the sky bit of wishful thinking to imagine that achieving a Scandinavian style integrated system in the next 4 years is possible, but I'm convinced such a system would ultimately reduce costs and increase benefits for disadvantaged children, even without an increase in benefit generosity. And that's really all that I am going to say now. I may have already taken up more than the time I was supposed to, but I will pass this on to Shani Buggs, who is who's a professor in the violence prevention program. Take it away, Shani.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. As Dr. Page said, I'm Shani Buggs, assistant professor with the Violence Prevention Research Program here. And my area of research focus is on community gun violence. And there is an insidious and vicious cycle between poverty and inequality and community gun violence. And when I talk about community gun violence, I'm talking about specifically interpersonal gun violence that is not involving intimate partners or domestic partners, but is gun violence that occurs in public places. So as I said, it excludes domestic or intimate partner violence, but would include mass casualty shootings. But when we're talking about the relationship between poverty and inequality and gun violence, we're really talking about gun violence in cities, the interpersonal violence that you hear about, unfortunately, too often on the news. And gun violence is both a cause and a consequence of poverty and inequality. The structural drivers of community gun violence result in decreased economic prospects and substandard educational systems and housing instability. And then those factors contribute to a lack of community safety and increase the risk of violence perpetration, which further worsens economic and safety conditions. And I will, please excuse my cat. Sorry. And so therefore, reducing community gun violence expands opportunities for economic stability and mobility for impacted families and communities. Addressing poverty and inequality through policies will also then strengthen gun violence prevention efforts. So the same communities with high rates of gun violence that have experienced the greatest amount of neglect and disinvestment for decades through structurally and institutionally racist policies are the same communities that presently experience high rates of poverty and unemployment, low educational attainment, high rates of residential turnover and housing instability, and high rates of poor health outcomes. And those health outcomes include short and long-term psychological effects, post-traumatic stress, difficulty concentrating, withdrawal, anger, desensitization, hypervigilance, anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and suicidal behavior. In children, it also results in difficulty concentrating and focusing in school, which then, does factor into low educational attainment. Gun violence also impacts quality of life. It reduces quality of life. It reduces social and economic productivity of both the individuals who are harmed and survivors and people who are exposed to violence, who know about the violence. The impacts of violence are far greater than just the person who was wounded. And gun violence in communities then reduces economic investment in those communities and results in decreased property value and increased insurance premiums. And all of these, as you can imagine, impact the bottom lines of families and communities in terms of financial, in terms of their financial situation, their financial outcomes. When you talk to frontline violence prevention workers who engage with those who are at highest risk for violence involvement, they report that the greatest challenges that their intended clients face are related to poverty and inequality. They are housing insecurity, it's food insecurity, it's lack of living wages, it's lack of steady employment. And so policies that address poverty and inequality will in turn help to reduce gun violence. So in terms of policy recommendations, specifically, increasing social welfare spending and linking spending to employment opportunities to provide skill development that help to limit free time, but also build confidence and self-efficacy related to changing one's outcomes have shown to be effective. Staggering payments throughout the month versus one-time monthly payments has been shown to have effect on reducing gun violence. Increasing housing options for individuals at high risk of violence involvement, including individuals who are violently injured and individuals returning from incarceration, is is a major challenge for those who are at high risk for violence involvement. And so having opportunities for stable housing is critical. Reducing barriers associated with victim of crime funds. Currently, there are a number of stipulations around accessing funds for victims of crime, including cooperation with law enforcement, including regular visits to probation or to law enforcement agencies that might, for a number of reasons, might be difficult for survivors of violence to achieve, and yet they still deserve to have access to ways to support their lives and their families. We also need to increase employment opportunities and living wages for low-skilled workers, including those who are returning from incarceration. And so I will stop there and give it back to Mary Ann. I'm not sure who I'm to pass it to. Thank you.
I guess I'll just go ahead. I'm Marian Bittler. I'm in the econ department at UC Davis. I think I'm next, but someone will tell me to shut up if I'm not next. And I'm going to be talking about
Sorry, Marianne, I was on mute. I did introduce you, but nobody heard you.
I'm going to talk a little bit about UI and food assistance and TANF. I study the safety net writ large, including the ITC and unemployment insurance. And recently, I did some work with Diane Schanzenbach and Hillary Hoynes about the responsiveness of this safety net to COVID. So I have some thoughts based on that. And so the big takeaway is, I think anybody who saw the pictures of people waiting 10 hours in order to get food from a food bank in Houston, I think it was, knows that there are lots of people who are suffering despite enormous amounts of dollars that have gone out. So dollars were slow to get out, new programs were hard to ramp up, and too many people had to apply for benefits. So for example, CBPP estimated that about 12 million people had to actually apply for their economic impact payments. And I think this just highlighted this need to modernize certain programs, to standardize data reporting more as suggested by the Evidence-Based Policy Commission in order to do the kind of data integration that Marianne was talking about. Okay, so I'm going to first talk about UI. I think this crisis has shown us that UI is an urgent need of reform because it's such a counter-cyclical program. You know, in normal times it meanders along, and then when crisis strikes, it's hard for UI agencies to ramp up quickly. So they were slow to roll out both the PUA program, which pays benefits to folks who normally would not be eligible for UI, as well as the extra payments, the $600 in the FPUC and the $300 or $400 in LWA. There were enormous delays in processing the huge number of claims and a lot of fraud as well. And I want to highlight that before COVID, there was also huge variation across states in the share of unemployed persons who get unemployment insurance. So I think this number is from around 2018, and about 38% of people got benefits, and this ranged from 10% in North Carolina to 52% in New Jersey. Clearly, some part of this could be something about the kinds of workers and the rules in the states, but there are other things going on as well. Okay, so I have two kinds of suggestions. In terms of responses now, I think it would be nice to extend PUA with triggers until things are back to normal. And this is a theme here. Instead of having Congress have to agree to deal with situations that are bad, we should have automatic triggers built into the system so that nobody has to decide it's time to expand things. I also think some of the top-ups are useful for the people who are at the low end of the unemployment insurance benefit distribution. And I think it would be nice if the Department of Labor could consider giving states a bit of a break on fraud so that they don't slow down dollars to the most needy. So states are very concerned about being on the hook for payments that the federal government is supposed to pay for, like PUA and FPUC. And so therefore, there's a tension between getting dollars out quickly and potential fraud, which they might have to pay back. Okay, so this has resulted in, perhaps the people with the least history and the hardest time documenting their eligibility ending up with their payments paused. I also have some longer run suggestions for reforming our UI system. I think the taxable wage base, which is the part of your wages that unemployment insurance premiums are paid on, should be raised. It's been $7,000 since 1983, and California is one of the states at this low end, and it should be indexed to inflation. This low level that this is set at means that when demand ramps up quickly, states aren't unable to pay without help from the federal government. Okay, I think we need more and better data reported to the federal government so we can tell how many people are getting UI. You would think this is an easy number to know, but it's actually a quite hard number to know how many people are getting benefits. It's easy to know how many weeks have been claimed, but that doesn't translate into people. We should incentivize states to do a better job of getting dollars to people, not to measure just claims. And we should set a more uniform program that has higher minimum numbers of weeks for states and earnings and work experience minimums. Maximums, I think that should say. Finally, I think we should have triggers for the, what frequently happens when times are bad is the federal government pays temporary emergency benefits. And this should be set up with triggers and on and off switches, as opposed to something where Congress has to get together and talk about it. I think we need to consider ways of expanding coverage to the gig workers, but this will also require some system for collecting premiums, and standardized applications would help. And Wadner has a working paper at Upjohn that has other concrete proposals for reforming this program. Now to food assistance. Some of these reforms are actually in proposed executive orders that I don't think have been issued yet from Biden. So the pandemic EBT program pays cash to people who would have gotten school meals in, during normal times because their schools are closed. And it has taken USDA until recently for 3 states to be approved to pay this program out, even though many states, including California, a large chunk of districts in California, many schools have been closed all year. I think they should continue free meals distribution, so that folks who are not getting other things can get access to that. I think states should be encouraged to not re-up their recertification rules for SNAP and other programs. And I'd like to see SNAP extended beyond the 4-month extension that's in the most recent stimulus bill. In the longer run, I think that the Thrifty Food Plan, which is what sets the max benefit level, should be revamped. Triggers for ABODs are this rule that if you're an able-bodied adult without dependents, that you should only be on SNAP some of the time when it's easy to get jobs. States should not have to apply for these things. This should be something that's set as an automatic trigger. And I think we should have triggers for expanding SNAP when economic conditions warrant, like the maximum allotment payments during COVID and the maximum benefit levels that have been increased. And then finally, I think for TANF, there should be more reporting from the states so that we can learn more about where dollars are going and whether they're doing the right thing. And I think there should be more reporting of individual level data to the federal government so it's easier for these programs to be monitored. We're paying for these programs. The data should be shared with the federal government. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Marianne. I did see that there was a question in the chat. One was a clarifying question that got answered, and another is a more substantive question. But we're going to just keep going and take your question to the breakout room afterwards, and just in the interest of time. So thank you. The next speaker is Ryan Finnegan from the Department of Sociology, and he's going to talk a little bit about homelessness.
Hi, thanks everyone. So I'm going to do just a few minutes on a little bit of background information about the dynamics of homelessness in the US, some of the policies from the Biden campaign platform that seem most relevant, and what I see as some of the potential challenges in implementing these policies. So first, some basic numbers. Over 500,000 people on a single night in January 2019 were experiencing homelessness, either in shelters or sleeping in the streets or other structures not meant for human habitation. Homelessness is obviously especially common in California, with about 150,000 people experiencing homelessness in California on a single night in January 2019. California has 1 in 8 people in the US population, but it has over 1 in 4 of the people experiencing homelessness. Experiences of homelessness are very dynamic, and the dynamics differ from place to place. In San Francisco and Oakland in 2019, for example, about 1 in 3 people experiencing homelessness were homeless for the first time within the last year. So there are many short-lived experiences of homelessness where people cycle in and out. Estimates vary, but the total number of people who experience homelessness at all over the course of an entire year could be more than twice as high on the counts for a single night. So it could be up to 1 million or even 1.5 million people experiencing homelessness at some point in the year. Over the course of people's lives, estimates vary, but it could be as much as 4 to 5% of the entire US population has ever experienced homelessness at some point in their lives. Despite associations between homelessness and mental illness and substance abuse, the availability of affordable housing is the single strongest and most consistent predictor of rates of homelessness between places. Given the profound systemic racism in basically every aspect of the housing market, there are major racial and ethnic disparities in exposure to homelessness. In 2019, about 2/5 of people experiencing homelessness were Black, which is about 3 times the representation in the population. About half of families with children experiencing homelessness were Black, and this hardship and instability in childhood can have lasting effects over the life course. Obviously, this is probably getting worse in the pandemic. We don't necessarily have the data about this yet, but it could increase homelessness in a couple ways. First, there's a lot of concern that the pandemic is pushing people and families into homelessness via a combination of job loss and evictions. Second, the pandemic could also make it more difficult for people who were already experiencing homelessness to exit homelessness and transition back into housing. So in the work that I've done with folks experiencing homelessness in the Bay Area and in Sacramento, a lot of the folks that I've talked about didn't necessarily lose jobs or housing since the pandemic started, but their hopes to get jobs or transition back into housing were dashed as the pandemic dragged on. So it's just compounding the disadvantage that they were experiencing prior to the pandemic. The Biden set of housing policies, there's a ton of them, which great, but there's a lot of them that could tackle the issue of homelessness from a couple of different directions. So first, there are several programs to make housing more affordable, which could lessen homelessness by preventing entrances into homelessness and loss of housing. First, the Biden platform wants to expand Section 8 housing vouchers. So these are meant to assist the affordability of housing so that people who get this voucher only have to pay up to 30% of their income for rental housing. The voucher covers the rest of the cost. We currently have that program, but it is not an entitlement. There's a set budget, and then once that budget has been expended, folks who are eligible do not receive the benefit. Currently, about 3 in 4 eligible households for rental assistance do not receive it. And so this proposal would be to expand the program into basically an entitlement so that all eligible families receive the benefit. In addition, the Biden platform wants to enact what they are calling the Homeowner Renter Bill of Rights, which would prohibit landlords from discriminating against renters who receive these federal housing benefits. Currently, it is not required that landlords accept the housing voucher, even though there is actually an economic incentive to accept voucher holding households because they're guaranteed some fraction of the rent. But many landlords discriminate against folks with the voucher because they think of them as troublesome. Another Biden program that would prevent entrances into homelessness would be a new renter's tax credit. This is a tax credit that's designed to reduce the total cost of rent and utilities to 30% of total income for low-income individuals and families that make too much money for the Section 8 voucher. So the Section 8 voucher would help very low-income families and individuals. Usually it's capped to some fraction of area median income so that they're only paying 30% of their income in the rent. For people who make more than the threshold to get the voucher, the tax credit would help adjust the total cost that they were paying. And then finally, they're trying to institute stronger eviction protections. That would include legal assistance for folks at risk of eviction and eviction diversion programs, including different kinds of mediation programs with landlords. And then next, there's a set of proposals to facilitate exits from homelessness. So among people currently experiencing homelessness, these programs would help transition outward. One of the main agenda items is to reform federal housing programs to what they call the housing first approach. The housing first approach prioritizes access to permanent and or supportive housing, but without the attachment of various kinds of conditions or strict requirements. That includes things like participation in substance abuse counseling issues, employment requirements, et cetera. So currently, many programs designed to help people transition out of housing require participation in a variety of programs or a set of preconditions before one has access to this kind of transitional or supportive housing. The Housing First model flips that around, and the theory is that housing is kind of the fundamental core of achieving any of these other kinds of benchmarks that these programs stipulate. So without access to housing, finding a job, substance abuse counseling, et cetera, these things are difficult, if not impossible. So the Housing First program is designed to make sure that the housing is provided in order to facilitate these other kinds of goals. So some of the potential challenges that I see in some of these policies. So first, I'll just say, like, I think all of these are great policies, and if they're able to be administered flawlessly, they will do an amazing job. But of course, flaws are inherent in all policies. One of the difficulties, I think, for the expansion of affordable housing programs is that the availability and accessibility of quality housing goes well beyond what the programs themselves are able to dictate. This is particularly true given exclusionary zoning restrictions in many places. The Biden policy program has grants that are designed to address that, but I think it's a much larger issue than what a federal grant system can address. There's also enduring racial and ethnic segregation and ongoing discrimination in basically every aspect of the housing market. And we've had programs that have tried to tackle this with varying degrees of, I don't know, sincerity is maybe the word, over the course of the last 50, 60 years. And obviously it's a very entrenched and large sweeping problem. Next, I think the eviction protections that we currently have are obviously necessary to keep going in the future, and legal assistance for people at risk of eviction is really helpful, but many, if not most, evictions are informal. So many people experience eviction without ever going to eviction court. And so there needs to be more proactive work to protect folks from these kinds of informal evictions. And then finally, a lot of the Housing First programs, like the evidence, I think, is very strong that these are the most effective programs that we have for transitioning people out of homelessness. But part of the challenge is that there's often not much clarity on what actually counts as a Housing First program. One of the core tenets of Housing First is autonomy and choice, so that folks experiencing homelessness choose to participate in the program. There are not a variety of restrictive requirements like program participation for substance abuse counseling or employment seeking, and that when folks are ready to participate in their programs that they choose to, they wind up being much more successful and are facilitated by having access to stable housing. Many of the programs that we think of as Housing First in the United States actually do still have a number of these requirements, or have a variety of conditions and stipulations about who can access the programs. I think in California, the Project Home Key, which is the extension of the hotel program for people experiencing homelessness at high risk of COVID-19, many people think of that as a Housing First program because it's designed to rapidly rehouse people and then include supportive programs on top of that or in addition to that. But again, there's a lot of restrictions in who has access to the program and how one accesses the program. It's done in collaboration with a lot of local areas, but that collaboration with local areas often means fragmentation in terms of how one navigates the program, which for many people experiencing homelessness and for service providers that are trying to coordinate with the program can turn into a maze. And that bureaucratic maze is a major hurdle for folks accessing the program. So another core tenet of the Housing First programs is that they should be very easy and ready to access without condition. And so I think that kind of movement would be one of the kind of keys to making that program as successful as possible. I have no idea how long I've been talking, I'm sorry, but I am done now. So thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Our next speaker is Lisa Pruitt, who is going to be talking about rural poverty, and she's from the School of Law.
Sorry, I was trying to screen share and talking about it while I was muted. So let me try that again. Nope. Well, I have some really nice slides, but they seem not to be showing up on my as an opportunity for me to share them with you. So let me see if I can improve on that. So mostly today, here we go again. Let me try. Yeah, here we go. All right, so I hope you can see my slides. Yep, good. Okay. I write about rural-urban difference in relation to the law. And to write about rural people and places is ultimately to write about rural disadvantage. And most people don't know that poverty rates have long been higher in rural places than they have been in metropolitan ones. So I'm going to talk a lot today in my brief comments about metro versus non-metro, which is the county level designation. And so the rural poverty has, since we've been keeping records, typically been higher in rural areas than in urban ones. And persistent poverty is a particular problem that is associated with rural areas. So that is the designation by the federal government of places that have had a high poverty rate, so 20% or higher, over the last 4 decennial censuses. So that's a little bit of background. It was nice when Marianne asked me to participate in this today, because it just so happens that I had prepared or had participated in the writing and preparation of this op-ed, which appeared in yesterday's The Conversation. Our headline, as you can see, is 5 ways that Biden can help rural America thrive and bridge the rural-urban divide. So I'm just going to talk through what our 5 big ideas are. And if I have any time left, which I probably won't, may say a few more things. So first and foremost, there is a desperate need for expansion of broadband. And what this would require at the federal level is a reversion, what it would require first and foremost is a reversion to treating broadband as a public utility, which basically takes it back from pure market forces. Because if we just leave this up to the market, the lack of economies of scale and the added costs of trying to serve vast territories means that tribal communities and other rural communities are going to continue to be grossly underserved compared to their urban counterparts. Our second big idea is, particularly in the era of the pandemic, local governments need a lot of assistance to avoid going broke. And this has implications not only for the services that local governments provide to residents, and those services can implicate the safety net and programs that can help poor people, but they also implicate jobs, because jobs will of course be lost if local governments go broke. Our third big idea is to rein in big ag. Increasingly, the land in rural communities is owned by or controlled, if not owned, by what is generally called big ag. So there are a number of antitrust issues that need to be addressed, because what happens when corporate agriculture owns or controls the land in rural communities in rural America is the profits are sucked out of those communities and not enjoyed by the residents, even those who are engaged in farming, which is a smaller and smaller portion of the rural economy. Then we talk about broad racial justice issues. Most people in the sort of national imaginary associate rural America with whiteness, with white people, and in fact, 1 in 5 rural residents is a person of color. And it will probably not surprise anyone to know that the poverty rates among people of color in rural America tends to be much higher than those among white people. So there are a number of issues that we discuss. Some of them relate to criminal justice, but basically we just acknowledge a broad array of issues, and also are really trying to educate people broadly about the existence of poor people of color in rural communities, including, of course, American Indian populations, the Latinx population in the Rio Grande Valley, and African Americans in the Black Belt and the Mississippi Delta. And then lastly, we call for a return to the basics, by which we really acknowledge that rural America has not recovered from the Great Recession to the extent that urban America has. The recovery has been much slower. And now, of course, with the pandemic, there is a huge setback for rural communities. So we really advocate for another New Deal, another war on poverty, but the sorts of comprehensive programs that would provide the jobs that rural people need and rural communities need in order to be sustained. So I think, remarkably, I've already taken up 5 minutes, but I will just mention for folks who may be looking for sources of information that the U.S. Department of Agriculture publishes a great deal of data about rural America. And they typically publish rural America at a glance only once every 3 or 4 years. But just last month, they published a 2020 edition, which is really dedicated to the impacts of the pandemic on rural America. So it's a great resource for people who are looking for more information. Thank you all.
Thank you, Lisa. Our next speaker is Paco Martorell, who is going to be speaking about student loans, and he's coming from the School of Education.
All right, well, thanks. Thank you to the organizers for having me. I'm going to be talking about student loan policy and the current discussion about cancellation of student loans, and whether we should do it and by how much. So just to give a little bit of a sense of the magnitude of the issue here, a little bit of background on student loans. Student loans are a big deal. So there's about $1 trillion in outstanding federal student loans. And one estimate is about 1 in 5 adults have some student loan outstanding. So it touches a lot of people. The student loans, as kind of like the importance of personal debt, has been increasing over time relative to, say, mortgage loans or auto loans or things like that. And that reflects partly increases in college tuition. And those increases in turn reflect reductions in state support for higher education that's happened across the country. And one thing that's different, distinguishes student loans from other kinds of loans, like these federal loans, is that defaulting on them is really bad. So not only does it hurt your credit rating in the same way that defaulting on other loans would do, but the federal government has a lot of power to garnish wages, even kind of taking things out of your Social Security benefits or other federal income supports like that. Those can be reduced if you are delinquent on your student loans, and you can't get out of it via bankruptcy the way you can with other kinds of debt. So there's a lot of discussion recently in the past presidential election about what to do about this and whether we should have some cancellations. So one thing that I think is something that I didn't really appreciate until this past election was that the education department makes the loans itself. So that means that the education department can cancel this debt kind of unilaterally. It doesn't need approval from Congress to happen. So there's no Mitch McConnell, there's no Joe Manchin, all of these kind of people that are kind of the reason why a lot of progressive legislation can happen. That's not as important for student loans. And so one of the kind of like the prominent proposals in the past election was the one by Bernie Sanders, where he proposed canceling all outstanding student loans and coupled that with plans to reduce or eliminate tuition at public colleges and universities. And I think that kind of like set the current debate in motion. And right now, with the pandemic, there's via executive orders has been a pause on federal loan payments and interest accrual, and that's extended through the end of this month. And I expect that to be extended, for at least a period of time, as we're certainly in the midst of the pandemic. And there's a lot of pressure on the Biden administration to have some kind of debt cancellation that goes beyond these temporary pandemic-related measures. But there's lots of debate about the details of this. So there's debates about how much of a cancellation. So, Bernie Sanders proposed fully canceling debts. Others proposed capping it at $50,000 or $10,000. There's debates about whether this be means tested, whether people, high income earners, for instance, would not be eligible for this cancellation. There's also debate about whether or not this should go through Congress. So right now, it looks like to the extent that we know, it looks like Biden is supporting something limited, like a $10,000 cancellation that's means tested and that would require approval by Congress. So this would be quite disappointing for people pushing for something bigger. So I want to talk a little bit about why there are arguments for canceling debt. What's the rationale here? So in terms of like economic consequences, like macroeconomic benefits, there's good research that shows that student loans limit home ownership, car purchases have limit disposable income that people have for spending. And the borrowers that are at greatest risk of financial distress are precisely those people who oftentimes didn't complete their college degrees or have degrees from dodgy for-profit institutions that don't have a lot of economic value in the labor market. So their schooling doesn't really provide the returns that would allow them to pay off their loans. And couple that with the increasingly bleak economic prospects for kind of current college students and recent college graduates given the pandemic. And I think there's a pretty strong case for some debt cancellation. In addition, there are large racial disparities at play here. So one study showed that a typical Black borrower still owes about 95% of the debt after 20 years compared to only about 6% of the loans remaining for whites after 20 years. And the gaps in non-repayments on student loans have been worsening over time. There are some pretty compelling arguments, I think, against across-the-board debt cancellation. So there's some distributional arguments at play here. So one study showed that about a third of debt is held by earners in the top quarter of the income distribution. So across the board, debt cancellation would represent a pretty big transfer to pretty high earners. And there's also questions about what would we do about current students and future students who are incurring debt. There's a horizontal equity issue here. What are we going to do for the people that are going to be getting debt in the future? And there's also people that claim that this is a political loser since it would benefit a relatively small percent of the population. Although, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people would directly benefit from an across-the-board debt cancellation. So there are some good arguments, though, kind of against this. So the arguments, I think, for more complete or at least more generous cancellation, I think, for me, the political argument here is, I think, pretty strong, is that means-tested schemes and kind of having something complicated where you kind of limit how much you cancel, those are complicated and limit the political base that would be directly benefiting from this. And I think that it would undermine the political support for this kind of a move. There's, in terms of the distributional issues, while it's true that there are some, that a lot of the debt is held by relatively high income earners, the fact is that these are people that all of whom took out student loans. So the really well-off people are largely not taking out student loans. And the people that have loans, and even if they have high incomes, they often don't come from the intergenerational wealth that is as we all know, has really important implications for financial well-being. And and I think in terms of like the trade-offs here, so like one argument that you hear is that, well, we can't do something like this because that means we couldn't do something else. For me, that I don't find that all that compelling, because it's not like there is a clear clear trade-off between doing student loan cancellation and something else. It's not like we're choosing between something like Bernie Sanders' free college program and canceling debt. That something like that would have to go through Congress, likely isn't really on the table, or might not happen at all. Debt cancellation, which can go through executive orders, seems like something that could be done and would benefit a lot of people. So those are some of my thoughts about student loans, and I'll pass it back to Marianne.
Great. Thanks, Paco. Our next speaker is Michelle Coe. She's a professor in the School of Public Health.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. I just wanted to say, I think certainly we are in a time in which a public health crisis is an economic crisis, and the economic crisis is a public health crisis. I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about short-term, but move quickly to long-term sort of pie in the sky. I started to feel over the year that we have to remind ourselves of our pie in the sky, because sort of the short-term fixes aren't really going to fix even this pandemic, and they're not going to fix the intersection between racism and this pandemic. So first of all, very short-term, poverty-related health policy issues, Medicaid. The Trump administration approved a few state waivers just as they were headed out the door and for Medicaid, and tried to said they approved them for 10 years to try to prevent reversal by the Biden administration. That's certainly problematic for the types of waivers that they approved. For example, one was Tennessee, which moved towards a block grant, which really, I think in the face of a pandemic, you would think as a block grant seems the most obvious thing not to do. You don't want a fixed amount of funding for healthcare services. Nevertheless, even per enrollee, and nevertheless, it's been approved. We don't even know what the long-term fallout is going to be, both between the economic crisis as well as long-term health consequences people have from COVID-19, those who survive. So those are challenges. So I think looking forward, I think the Biden administration will try to figure out ways that they can pull back or have increased review of those waivers, because at this point, it's not even about Medicaid expansion to more states, but just protection of existing Medicaid, I think is the take on it. But there are things you can do certainly in other areas, Medicare, lowering the age limit to start moving towards broader protection for eligibility. And then there definitely needs to be some real rethinking on how much investment we put into long-term services and supports. There's, the impact of the pandemic on nursing homes and nursing home residents, and really thinking about alternative ways for both reimbursement and sort of alternatives to institutional care. So at any rate, all of these, though I said, are short-term and small policy issues in some sense in terms of coverage around the margins in a way. I think it should be always clear to everyone that health care coverage is the number one function is financial protection, not access to healthcare. And again, really made clear by this pandemic, we have a really strapped healthcare system at this point. People are really running on fumes in many places. A lot of private practices and groups across the country have closed. And then we already have, even with or without Medicaid expansion, a lot of providers that don't even take Medicaid, or the access to care even within Medicaid can be really challenging. And again, all of this is sort of related to sort of the racism within the system, the lack of diversity in the workforce, the lack of diversity in the leadership and planning around how healthcare systems are distributed and allocated, which continues to make the pandemic worse, or has made it worse. And then the other problem being that coverage is really still closely tied to employment for a lot of people in this country. Problematic when a lot of people lose jobs, or problematic when there are states that try to impose work requirements. it will likely not be defended by the Biden administration, but nevertheless, the Supreme Court so far is still going to take up this question of whether or not the country can, within Medicaid, require people to work. Again, not making sense when there's not a lot of jobs. And then sort of the last, bigger problem is that healthcare isn't really health. Right now, healthcare in the US is still incentivized for profits, even if they're claimed to be not-for-profit entities and based on services provided and not, community health. The reimbursement system isn't really set up to deliver that, to deliver health in a community. So all that being said, I think there's a lot of restructuring that needs to happen in healthcare that needs to be community-oriented and also really be able to respond to a public health crisis. And so I think the pie in the sky would be moving towards, I think, a single payer system. But hopefully it's less pie in the sky with every year that happens. It will free up some of the state variation. It will free up the employment connection, but also one of the hard parts about changing the way healthcare delivered is right now with many different payers, it's hard to get them all on board to reimburse for the same things. So we've seen over the years, many times to try to do payment to incentivize things like reducing health inequities. And it's hard to do that when some providers are doing payment in multiple directions. So I think that's part of it. And the other part that I've thought about a lot in the past year is I think people before were more interested in having universal coverage and were tended to be agnostic about the way it went about, whether or not it was a single government payer versus, multiple private entities, but with more uniform standards, was the attempt in the healthcare marketplaces. But I think what we've also learned is that, at least when we can see in other countries that successfully have fought off this pandemic, or, one of the most successful, certainly being Taiwan, one thing that people don't talk about enough is the essential part of their effort was having an integrated health information technology system and being able to use integrated health data as a way to combat public health crises. And that only happens pretty much if we start moving towards some single unified reimbursement or some single claim system. And so I think simply for the purposes of public health functions, having something that has unification across information sharing is critical. We've seen in our country that having public health be delivered through our really patchwork disaggregated healthcare system is is a disaster. Even just now, vaccine distribution that partially goes through our healthcare system is kind of a disaster. So I think that's kind of where we'd like to go, is again, still staying focused on something like single payer. And then really also to my point of there are certain issues about there are many opportunities in which healthcare itself maintains sort of structural racism and poverty, inequality. These are all tied together. So trying to move towards a more uniform federal system will also not fix it entirely, but reduce at least some of the avenues that happen when you have a state-based program. So I think that was all I was going to say. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. We have two more speakers and then we will move into breakout rooms. Our second to last speaker is Jenna Stearns, and she's from the Department of Economics, and she's going to be talking about issues related to childcare and family leave.
Okay, hi everyone. So today in the US, most parents of young children now work outside of the home. And yet the US lags behind most other high-income countries in access to social supports for working parents that make work-life family balance easier, such as paid family leave and subsidized childcare. So access to paid family leave in particular is highly limited and unequal across the wage distribution in the US. Just kind of as a point of reference, only 9% of low-wage workers in the country have access to paid family leave, any amount of paid family leave, even one day, through their employer. But a growing number of states, including California, have tried to address this lack of access to paid leave by implementing their own universal access paid family leave programs. These programs provide partial wage replacement during periods of leave to either bond with a new child or care for a sick relative more generally. These programs have been shown to have a number of positive benefits for both children and their working parents, including improvements in child health during infancy, and improvements in child health that persist into later childhood as well, improvements in maternal, physical, as well as mental health, and improvements in maternal employment rates, both in the short run around the time of the birth of a child, and also in many cases that persist into the longer term as well. So these paid leave policies are really an effective way to increase women's labor market attachment in a period where women tend to become permanently unattached to the labor market. But if we really want these types of paid leave policies to serve as a way to increase female labor force participation and maternal employment rates, we really need to think about what comes next. For women to remain in the workforce at the end of the period of paid leave around a birth, they need to have access to some sort of either informal or formal childcare. Over 61% of children under 5 in the US attend some sort of regular childcare, but center-based childcare in particular is unaffordable for many families, and particularly for low-income families. Just as an example, a year of center-based childcare for an infant in California would cost 60% of median income for a single-headed household in California, and over 20% of the median income of a two-earner household in California. So this is incredibly unaffordable, particularly for low-income families. Low-income children and children of color are also less likely to receive access to high-quality childcare, regardless of whether it's center-based or not. And this exacerbates inequality in a variety of dimensions, particularly in terms of school readiness, which has long-term implications on educational attainment, future earnings, etc. Intensive, high-quality childcare has been shown to have very positive effects on children's short and long-term educational and health outcomes, and can actually increase earnings enough to decrease reliance on safety net programs when these children enter adulthood. But the important caveat here is the quality of the childcare program matters a lot in whether or not we see positive effects. Childcare issues also have become, I think, particularly salient this past year during the pandemic. We've seen an incredibly dramatic drop in female labor supply in the past 9 months. And this is almost entirely driven due to the need of mothers to stay home with children as they've lost access to other forms of childcare, including access to daycares for younger children and schools shutting down or going remote for older children. So just quickly, the Biden and Harris administration has proposed, I think, a fairly ambitious agenda to improve access to both of these types of programs for families with young children. Biden's proposal for a paid family and medical leave plan would provide access to about 12 weeks of partially paid leave for either one's own medical needs or to care for a new child or sick relative. I think this is unlikely to be at the forefront of their agenda right now in particular, but more immediately, Biden's COVID relief package currently calls for billions of dollars in childcare subsidies for low-income families, as well as an expanded refundable child care tax credit on top of the child tax credit that would substantially reduce the cost of childcare for both low and middle to high income families. His longer-term childcare plans would include a continuation of these same benefits, increasing both the length and the generosity, as well as, again, some fairly ambitious ideas to provide universal access to pre-K education, as well as invest in increasing the quality of childcare available through through investments in teachers and paying childcare providers better than they're currently paid. I think there's just a couple of issues I'll briefly mention. One is these policies have potentially large benefits but are very costly. Two is that at the moment, we need a lot of infrastructure to be able to increase both quality and access to childcare. So providing childcare subsidies does not necessarily immediately increase the number of childcare slots available, nor the number of qualified childcare providers. And so we need to make investments kind of more broadly in order to make sure that children can not only access childcare, but safe and high quality childcare.
Thanks so much, Jenna. And last but not least, my co-director, Jacob Hibble.
Thank you, Marianne, and thanks to all the rest of our speakers and everyone here attending. I'm going to go quickly because I'm eager to get to the discussion portion. I know all of you are too. It's also going to be easy for me to go quickly because Dr. Stearns just made a lot of the points that I plan to make. So I'm going to talk about K through 12 inequalities and what the next administration might do. Two quick things to note first. In selecting the Connecticut Commissioner of Education, Miguel Cardona, as the Secretary of Education nominee, and San Diego Unified School District Superintendent Cindy Martin as the Deputy Education Secretary. The Biden administration is signaling that their education focus is going to be on public K through 12 schools, and will engage leaders who have experience combating inequalities experienced by English learners, socioeconomically disadvantaged students, and students with disabilities. And I find that encouraging. Second, although this is essentially a fait accompli, it is still important to mention that the Biden administration will reinstate the Obama-era civil rights guidance that Betsy DeVos's Department of Education rescinded, which will again allow transgender students to use the restrooms of their choice in US schools, and will also refocus attention on ethno-racial disparities in school discipline. So again, an important step, in this case, back toward greater equality. Okay, so over the next 4 years, I would like to see the Biden administration recognize two paradoxes of education and inequality in our country and prioritize policies that reflect them. So first, our individualistic, meritocracy-obsessed culture tends to treat education as both the cause and the solution to individuals' troubles. This is why we often hear that fixing our education system is what's going to help us solve poverty. In fact, we need to flip that relationship around, and we should recognize that the best way to fix education is by reducing childhood poverty. The Biden administration should take seriously the notion that education disparities are a symptom, not strictly a cause, of broader structural inequalities. Which brings me to paradox number two, which is that the most effective policies for improving equality of educational opportunity will actually have nothing to do with K-12 schools. It's, of course, important to always work on improving the quality and consistency of K-12 instruction, but until we take seriously the mission to tackle structural inequalities children experience outside the classroom, all of these factors that create massive school readiness disparities before children ever even set foot inside of a classroom, without taking those seriously, we're always going to be limited in the amount of progress we can make. So with those paradoxes in mind, I'm actually fairly optimistic about the potential for the new administration to make some impactful investments that will reduce education inequality. And these are things that Jenna just mentioned, actually. So in the past few years, there's been pretty substantial growth in bipartisan support for universal pre-K. Back when he was on the campaign trail, then candidate Biden often touted universal pre-K as a linchpin of his education platform. And so now it's time for him to follow through on that promise and guarantee free and academically enriching preschool opportunities to all 3- and 4-year-olds in the US. But if I can go a little bit further out on that limb, I would argue that 3 years old is actually still just an arbitrary point to begin offering or guaranteeing free high quality childcare. And it's also too old of an age. I agree with Dr. Stearns and also something that Dr. Page said earlier, that the administration should push to expand childcare benefits for infants and toddlers as well as preschoolers. One good approach could be to increase funding provided to states through the Child Care and Development Block Grants, and also to lengthen families' eligibility periods to provide for greater access, but also greater consistency and stability in low-income families' access to high-quality childcare arrangements. This would not only benefit their children's healthy development and their academic preparation, preparing them to begin school, but it also, as Professor Stearns noted, create new jobs in an expanded early childhood education sector, increase labor force participation among mothers of young children. Since we have apparently decided up till now that we as a nation are unwilling to follow the rest of the world in offering federally funded paid parental leave, the very least we should do is make it feasible for low-income working parents to obtain safe and supportive childcare while they return to work. Okay, that'll do it for now. I look forward to seeing some of you in the breakout rooms, which we'll head to now. Is that right, Jessica?
Great. Okay, so we're gonna let Jessica put us into breakout rooms and we hope to see some of you there.